The cardiac unit of Cedar Creek Medical exhaled the smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, the particular staleness of recirculated air that had passed through 1,000 sets of lungs. Laura Bennett moved through it at 11:13 p.m., her shift just beginning, pushing a med cart with the kind of economical precision that came from muscle memory older than most people's nursing licenses. She'd learned to move like this in places where wasted motion got people killed. Here, in Atlanta, with its humming monitors and warm fluorescent lights, it just made her look efficient. Competent. The kind of nurse who didn't ask questions. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, loose enough to conceal the webbing of white scar tissue that ran across her left shoulder like a road map of somewhere she'd never mention. Shrapnel from a 2009 IED that had painted her collarbone red on the floor of a field hospital in Tikrit. The scar had faded to the color of old bone now, 13 years later, visible only if someone looked closely and cared enough to ask. Nobody at Cedar Creek cared. They saw a nurse in her mid-40s with steady hands and a quiet demeanor who filled out her charts on time and didn't complain when she picked up extra nights. She didn't tell them she could perform an emergency cricothyrotomy by feel alone. That she'd saved 43 Marines in her last tour. That her lungs still remembered the smell of diesel fuel and blood underneath desert heat. The locker room on the 3rd floor was empty at this hour. Laura opened hers, the one at the far end, the one nobody else seemed to want, and hung her jacket on the hook. Inside, on the shelf behind her backup stethoscope, sat a small rectangular object wrapped in plastic. An American flag, the kind they gave you at funerals. 13 inches long. Folded into a triangle the way they taught you at Arlington. Underneath it, a card with a name written in handwriting that belonged to someone who was no longer breathing. She didn't look at it. She never looked at it during shift. That was a rule she'd made for herself on day one: keep the mission separate from the ghosts. Keep the two Lauras from colliding. Her left hand trembled slightly as she closed the locker door. Just a flutter, the kind of thing that only happened when she was alone. A private thing. A reminder of what happens when explosive force meets human tissue. By the time she turned to leave the locker room, her hand was steady again. Muscle control. Discipline. The same discipline that had kept her alive for 23 years and 4 months of active military service. The cardiac unit sprawled across the north wing of Cedar Creek's 3rd floor, a warren of rooms where hearts failed and sometimes, with enough luck and competence, came back to life. Laura made her way to the nurse's station, nodded to Trevor, the evening shift charge nurse, and began reviewing the night census. 3 post-op cardiac patients. 2 in ICU step-down. 1 new admit arriving in about an hour from the imaging center. Routine night. The kind where nothing happened and you went home tired but intact. It was the routine nights that were dangerous. That's when attention wandered. That's when people made mistakes. She found the file for room 317 and pulled it. James Morrison, 64 years old, former Marine, retired from active duty 15 years ago. CABG surgery 18 hours prior, coronary artery bypass graft, textbook procedure, uncomplicated recovery so far. Vitals stable. Ejection fraction improving. The kind of patient who should be home in 5 days, back in his house, maybe drinking decaf coffee on a porch somewhere while his body relearned how to exist without surgical intervention. She should have started with the other patients. Protocol said start with the most critical first. But something about Morrison's file made her stop. Maybe it was the little note in the admitting section. Deaf since age 7. ASL preferred. Hearing aid in left ear only, limited effectiveness. Had brought a sister to surgery, requested she be present for post-operative instructions. The room was dark except for the glow of the cardiac monitor. Morrison was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilation of his lungs, his body still knitting itself back together at a cellular level nobody could see. Laura stood in the doorway for 7 seconds, reading the story the machines were telling. Heart rate 68. Blood pressure 122/74. O2 saturation 96%. Respiratory rate 14. Every number a green light. Every number saying this man was going to be okay. She turned to leave and found Dr. Marcus Mercer standing behind her. He wasn't a tall man, maybe 5'10", the kind of height that made him have to prove things in other ways. He wore his white coat like authority, crisp and clean, the way it looked in pharmaceutical commercials. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and just about as warm. He'd been the attending on Morrison's surgical team, and he was smiling at her in a way that suggested he'd caught her at something. Checking on patients, Nurse Bennett. His voice carried the particular inflection of someone whose confidence had never been challenged by circumstance. Isn't that a little beyond night shift scope of practice? Laura had encountered men like him before. Officers who relied on rank the way other people relied on oxygen. She'd learned to talk to them in a language they understood. Deference. Soft edges. The kind of response that made them feel like they'd won before the conversation started. Just reviewing the post-op status, Doctor. Morrison had stable vitals when I came in. I wanted to make sure nothing changed before I settled him for the night. Her voice came out pitched lower than her normal register, careful. Practiced. The voice of someone who'd learned that taking up less space meant fewer problems. Mercer nodded slowly, the way people do when they're pretending to consider something they've already decided. That's the thing about night shift, he said. Too much time to think. Too much time lingering with patients. It's not efficient, Bennett. The real work happens during the day. You're here to maintain. Monitor. Don't overcomplicate things. He said it like he was teaching her something fundamental about the nature of nursing. Like efficiency was a virtue and care was a luxury. Laura felt the words settle into the space around her the way snow falls, soft, but accumulating. She'd heard versions of this before from people who'd never held a tourniquet on an artery that wouldn't stop bleeding. Who'd never had to triage human suffering down to who would live and who wouldn't based on what supplies they had left. Understood, Doctor. She said it automatically, a conditioned response to a command structure that still lived somewhere in her nervous system even after 13 years of civilian employment. Mercer was already moving past her, his attention already somewhere else, already cataloguing the other staff members who'd witnessed this small interaction. That was the thing about teaching moments like this, they weren't really about the lesson. They were about the audience. Laura waited until he was down the hallway, already speaking to someone at the nurse's station in tones that were conspicuously louder and more jovial than the ones he used with her, before she allowed herself to breathe. There was a small sound then, the hiss of the ICU equipment, a monitor somewhere else in the unit registering a rhythm change, the fluorescent lights overhead emitting their constant electrical whisper like insects in the dark. She had learned a long time ago that the first sign of a predator was the way they tested the boundaries. A comment here. An observation there. Casual remarks that established a baseline hierarchy. Mercer wasn't trying to hide it because he didn't need to. He had institutional permission. Rank. The assumption that came with a medical degree and a position at a hospital that didn't ask questions. What he didn't have was any idea who was standing in front of him. By the time Laura returned to the nurse's station, Trevor was already passing along the essence of the interaction in the way that hospital staff did, rapid-fire, efficient, coded. She caught pieces of it as she logged into the computer system. Lingering with patients. Overstepping. Probably trying to prove something. The narrative was already being written, and she'd played the part that Mercer had cast her in perfectly. The overachieving night shift nurse who didn't understand her place in the hierarchy. She pulled up Morrison's post-op protocol and began documenting her assessment in the electronic health record. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm from down the hall. In 20 minutes, she'd need to check his surgical drains. In 40 minutes, she'd need to run through vital signs on the other 2 post-op patients. In 2 hours, she might finally have time to sit down for 5 minutes and drink coffee that was still warm. This was the work. This was the piece of her life where she existed as a single, uncomplicated thing. A nurse. Someone who could ask questions in return, but didn't. Someone who accepted the architecture as it had been built and moved through it with competent hands and a quiet voice. But somewhere in her chest, underneath the scar tissue and the implanted defibrillator pad they'd installed during her last physical at Walter Reed, something else was waking up. Something that recognized a threat the way it had learned to recognize them in Tikrit, not because of what was said, but because of what was underneath the saying. The tone. The assertion of dominance. The belief that some people belonged in certain spaces and others didn't. The thing about bringing that part of yourself into a place like Cedar Creek Medical was that it never fully went to sleep. It just waited. Patient. Disciplined. Ready for the moment when the rules changed. And the thing about Dr. Mercer was that he'd just announced, to everyone within hearing distance, that he was the kind of man who believed the rules only applied to certain people. Laura would remember that. The cardiac unit hummed around her, monitors beeping in their particular digital language, the hiss of oxygen delivery, the soft squeak of shoes on linoleum, and she held the moment like a photograph, cataloguing every detail. His tone. His smile. The way the other staff members had looked at her after he left, a mixture of sympathy and calculation. This was the beginning of something. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the first move in a game where the rules hadn't been articulated yet, but everyone understood they were being played. The room went silent the moment Dr. Mercer's hand touched the door frame. Laura's hands were moving through the post-surgical instructions in fluid American Sign Language, her fingers spelling out the care schedule for James Morrison, the deaf retired Marine whose surgery she'd assisted on at 4 a.m. that morning. Morrison's adult daughter sat beside the bed, her eyes tracking every gesture, finally understanding what her father needed to hear, or rather, see. The relief on her face was unmistakable. That was the moment Mercer walked in. "Nurse Bennett." His voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "We have hospital-approved interpreter iPads for a reason." Laura's hand stilled mid-sign. She turned slowly, her spine perfectly vertical, her face a study in composure. Mercer stood in the doorway with his tablet tucked under one arm, his expression arranged into something between concern and condescension. Behind him, a nurse from the day shift lingered in the hallway, pretending not to watch. "This isn't a charity performance," Mercer continued, stepping into the room with the casual authority of someone accustomed to never being questioned. "Hospital policy exists to protect patients and staff." Morrison's daughter leaned forward. "My father prefers." "I understand the impulse," Mercer said, speaking directly over her without breaking eye contact with Laura. "But Ms. Bennett seems to think hospital policy doesn't apply to her. Perhaps she's confused about her role here." He turned to the family with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for this theatrical display. We'll have a proper interpreter tomorrow. A professional. Someone trained through our approved vendor network." The words landed like stones. Laura felt Morrison's eyes on her, confusion, then something darker. Recognition flickering, then extinguishing as Mercer's narrative rewrote the moment from compassionate care into rule-breaking theatrics. The daughter's grateful expression had already begun to shift, doubt creeping in at the edges. Laura took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless drone above her head, and she could smell the sharp antiseptic that had soaked into her scrubs 12 hours ago. She held Mercer's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. One tear escaped, just one, tracking down her cheek without permission, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact. "Mr. Morrison deserves communication he can understand," she said quietly. "Not equipment that satisfies billing codes." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mercer's smile crystallized into something cold and precise. "Document this insubordination," he said, speaking to the hallway nurse who was definitely listening now. Then he turned and left, his footsteps echoing back toward the administrative wing where he kept his office locked, his files carefully organized, his documentation meticulous. He was building something. Laura could feel it the way you feel a storm approaching, not visible yet, but coming. 2 days passed. 2 days of Laura moving through Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac unit with the invisible efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that being seen was often dangerous. The night shift had always been hers, the wounded hours when the hospital's true rhythms emerged, when the suits had gone home and only the people who actually cared for patients remained. That was the Cedar Creek she'd come to know. That was before Mercer decided to rewrite the social architecture of her world. She entered the break room on Thursday with her lunch container, the smell of grilled chicken and rice a temporary comfort. The main table held 6 nurses: Patterson, who worked the trauma bay; Chen, who'd helped Laura with a difficult full line last month; Rodriguez, Hutchins, and 2 others whose names Laura had learned but whose faces were already beginning to turn away. The conversation died. Not gradually. Completely. Mid-sentence, like someone had flipped a switch. Laura heard Patterson's voice cut off, something about a difficult patient from the afternoon shift, and then nothing but the ambient hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent lights buzzing their electric lullaby. One by one, they collected their food. Chen wouldn't meet her eyes. Rodriguez stood and turned her back, carrying her plate to the small table in the corner. Hutchins followed, then Patterson, then the 2 others. Within 30 seconds, Laura sat alone beneath the flickering lights, the noise of their departure still settling like dust. She opened her container. Took one bite. Chewed slowly, methodically, her jaw moving with the same precision she'd developed during those hours in Tikrit when eating meant survival and composure meant not showing the fractures. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like insects trapped in plastic, and she sat very still, her face betraying nothing, not the recognition of what was happening, not the weight of isolation, not the careful calculation that Mercer had accomplished in 48 hours what most people couldn't manage in months. The break room had never been warm, but now it felt like a tomb. By Friday afternoon, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board. Laura saw it when she clocked in for her shift, the printout laminated and posted with clinical precision beneath the hospital's rotating announcements about hand hygiene protocols and blood pressure monitoring standards. She read her own name as if it belonged to a stranger. L. Bennett, unauthorized procedures. Insubordination. Failure to follow communication protocols. 3 nurses read it while she restocked supplies at the medication cart 10 feet away. She heard the whispers, not the words, but the texture of them, the particular tone that people use when they're discussing someone they've decided to distance themselves from. The hiss of conversation, quick and venomous as snake grass in a dried-out field. That afternoon, she checked on Morrison. The medication was doing its work, leaving him drowsy and distant, his eyes moving without focus. He stared at her as she adjusted his blood pressure cuff, and she saw the moment his brain tried to connect the present to the past and failed. No recognition. No gratitude. No memory of the woman who had guided him through post-surgical care in the only language his brain could truly process. But she saw the tattoo on his forearm. Black ink, crude lettering, worked by someone without professional equipment. L. Bennett RN in letters that would last his lifetime. Her hand trembled. Just once. She steadied it against the side rail. Morrison blinked at her like a stranger and turned his face back toward the window, where the afternoon light was beginning its descent toward evening. Mercer watched from the doorway. She could feel his presence like a pressure change, the way the air itself seems to shift when a predator enters the room. She took one measured breath and let another single tear escape, wiping it away without breaking eye contact with the man who was destroying her. I've seen better men than you send soldiers to die over less than what you're hiding. The words came out soft enough that only Mercer could hear them, each syllable shaped with the precision of a weapon being loaded. She said nothing more. She finished checking Morrison's vitals, documented her findings in the chart with her usual meticulous attention to detail, and walked past Mercer into the hallway without waiting for a response. Mercer didn't try to stop her. He didn't need to. The paper trail was growing thicker by the day, documentation she'd never seen, complaints bearing signatures that didn't match the patients they were supposedly from, policy violations citing regulations she'd need to spend 3 hours reading to even understand. He was competent, which made him dangerous. He wasn't yelling. He was building. Building the case that would remove her from Cedar Creek Medical before she could uncover exactly how he'd been systematically overcharging the VA for unnecessary procedures on vulnerable veterans who had no one to advocate for them. What he didn't know was that Laura's nursing job had never been about nursing at all. Naval Intelligence had embedded her at Cedar Creek Medical 74 days ago with a single mission: document the fraud. She had 3 more days to gather the evidence her handler needed before the operation was shut down, before the window closed, before Captain Laura Bennett, the woman who had once dragged a wounded Marine through Tikrit's burning streets and gotten his name tattooed on his own skin in gratitude, was extracted from Atlanta, and this particular war was abandoned. The 72 hours between the write-up and the intelligence deadline became the longest count Laura had ever tracked. Not because of time's weight, but because of what she finally understood about Dr. Mercer's strategic precision. She'd been embedded at Cedar Creek Medical for 74 days with a single mission: document the fraud. Naval Intelligence suspected billing irregularities in the cardiac unit, unnecessary procedures, inflated charges, vulnerable patients who couldn't push back. Medicare losses estimated at $847,000 over 18 months. Her handler, a woman named Director Chen based out of the Pentagon's IG office, had given her a timeline: 90 days total. 3 to establish cover. 60 to gather evidence. 27 to extract before Mercer's patterns shifted or security protocols tightened. Laura had 4 days remaining. 4 days to transform observation into prosecution-grade documentation. What she hadn't anticipated was Mercer moving faster. The write-up on the unit board changed everything. Not because it threatened her employment, cover stories were expendable, but because it revealed his true calculation. The humiliation wasn't personal cruelty. It wasn't even about dominance. It was strategic annihilation. Mercer had recognized, on some level his conscious mind probably hadn't articulated clearly, that Laura's presence on the cardiac unit had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about surgical patterns. Questions about why Morrison, a 58-year-old deaf veteran with a single-vessel disease, needed a triple bypass when his imaging suggested staged intervention would have been appropriate. Questions about why the billing codes reflected more extensive procedures than the operative reports documented. She'd made a connection while reviewing charts in the break room at 2:44 a.m. on what was supposed to be her final documentation night. Mercer had scheduled himself for 7 cardiac procedures in the past 6 weeks, a rate 340% higher than the hospital's second-highest volume surgeon. The reimbursement code showed a pattern: every veteran patient, without exception, received the most aggressive intervention available. Every single one. The probability of that clustering occurring naturally was approximately 1.3%. The probability it was systematic billing fraud was 98.7%. Mercer wasn't a lazy surgeon with a god complex, not primarily. He was a criminal with institutional power protecting him. A man who'd calculated that Medicare would pay for unnecessary procedures on patients whose service-connected disabilities made them less likely to question surgical recommendations. A predator hunting the wounded. And he'd begun to suspect that Laura was hunting him. The isolation campaign made new sense now. The dismissive comments about her qualifications. The whisper campaign suggesting she was incompetent, unstable, possibly dangerous. He'd been building a paper trail in reverse, establishing her as unreliable, insubordinate, someone whose presence on the unit made staff uncomfortable. A nurse whose documentation would be questioned. Whose testimony wouldn't hold weight. A woman who could be discredited before she became a threat. It was brilliant predatory logic. Laura had learned predatory logic in Tikrit. She'd learned it from men who'd moved through cities with the terrible precision of apex predators calculating which prey could be taken. Men who understood power wasn't shouting, it was silence, documentation, institutional positioning. Mercer was operating from the same tactical playbook, just applied to billing codes and hospital politics instead of convoy routes. She pulled up his surgical schedule on the cardiac unit's shared server, cross-referencing it against the imaging she'd photographed with her secure phone, a device that looked like a standard smartphone but routed through Naval Intelligence's encrypted network. Mercer's next scheduled procedure was Morrison. The deaf Marine who'd recognized something in Laura's measured competence, who'd tattooed her name on his forearm as a reminder that some people still showed up when it mattered. Mercer had booked Morrison for a 3-vessel bypass, citing his post-discharge imaging as justification. The imaging that contradicted the clinical findings by every standard metric. Laura sent the analysis to Director Chen through a secure message board that looked like a hospital staff forum. Benign comments about cardiac protocols, flagged certain surgical decisions, embedded documentation. Chen would decrypt it from a secure terminal at the Pentagon. The message took 43 seconds to upload. Then Laura did something that would have made her handler's blood pressure spike. She prepared a secondary file. Not for intelligence purposes. For protection. She downloaded surgical images, billing codes, procedural notes, everything Mercer had recorded in the hospital system, and placed them in a folder labeled with the kind of administrative designation no one questioned. Backup_cardiac_protocol_2024. Hidden in plain sight in the network drive where hospital staff regularly stored routine files. If something happened to her intelligence operation, if the extraction timeline moved up, if Mercer made a move first, someone would find that documentation. Someone would know. The hardest part of undercover operations isn't maintaining the lie. It's maintaining the mission when the target reveals itself clearly enough that action becomes not just justifiable but necessary. Laura had been trained for this moment. Taught that the mission superseded the instinct. That exposure wasn't a disaster, it was the cost of the job. She'd extracted wounded Marines from worse odds. The next morning, she found the formal write-up slipped into her personnel file. The language was surgical, unauthorized procedures, scope of practice violation, insubordination, failure to follow chain of command protocols. 8 separate administrative violations. Each one constructed to create reasonable doubt about her judgment. Each one designed to make her future testimony sound like the complaint of a disgruntled employee being disciplined. Mercer had anticipated everything. He'd even timed it. The write-up came 3 days before Morrison's scheduled surgery. 3 days to isolate Laura, establish her as unreliable, make certain that if she objected to anything Mercer did with Morrison, it would sound like retaliation. Institutional poisoning. Predatory precision. A charge nurse named Deborah pulled her aside in the medication room, her voice lowered to the careful register people use when delivering unwelcome messages. Dr. Mercer made it clear. You're to have no independent authority on veteran cases. Any procedures, any decisions, he wants direct physician oversight documented. Deborah's expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with this directive, but institutional hierarchy had weight. He's concerned about liability. That's what he said. Liability. What Deborah didn't know was that Mercer had specifically chosen a deaf patient for this test. Morrison couldn't hear Mercer's voice. Couldn't recognize his tone or detect the reassurance that slips into a doctor's language when he's actually trying to help rather than exploit. Mercer could tell Morrison anything, proceed with whatever surgical plan he'd decided, and Morrison would move forward trusting the hospital system to protect him. The same system Laura had been sent to audit. 3 nights later, the alarm came at 11:43 p.m. Not the scheduled Morrison surgery, something worse. Morrison had been transferred to rehab after his initial post-op recovery, but complications had developed. Respiratory distress. Oxygen saturation dropping. The facility had transferred him back to Cedar Creek's cardiac unit for emergency evaluation. Laura heard about it from the night charge nurse, a woman named Patricia, who pointed to Morrison's room and said, "He came in about an hour ago." Shortness of breath. They're running imaging now. Laura moved toward his room with the particular quietness that comes from having learned to move through hostile territory. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. The training was automatic now, muscle memory from scenarios run 1,000 times in defense intelligence facilities, from situations where showing fear meant operational failure. Morrison was sitting up, his chest moving in shallow compensatory breaths. His daughter sat beside him, young, maybe 30, her hands forming signs that Morrison was trying to read despite the oxygen mask obscuring the lower half of his face. The monitors beside his bed showed something troubling, oxygen saturation at 94% despite supplemental oxygen. His heart rate elevated at 118. And his chest, his left side wasn't moving the way it should. Asymmetrical breathing. The kind of movement that suggested something was mechanically wrong, not just a routine cardiac event. Tension pneumothorax. Laura's assessment came instantly. Air in the pleural space. Pressure building. Slowly collapsing the lung from the inside. The kind of thing that could develop from aggressive chest procedures, from trauma to the pleural lining, from complications of central line placement. Morrison's case was classic: post-cardiac surgery, sudden respiratory distress, asymmetrical chest movement, oxygen saturation dropping despite supplemental flow. The solution was equally classic: needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. A 14-gauge angiocath needle inserted perpendicular to the chest wall, between the ribs, to release the pressurized air and allow his collapsed lung to re-expand. The procedure took 90 seconds. It saved lives in combat medicine routines across every theater on Earth. It was something Laura had performed on at least 4 different occasions in field conditions significantly less controlled than a modern hospital. But it required physician authorization. And Dr. Mercer had made certain of something. He arrived in Morrison's room at 11:51 p.m., 8 minutes after the code alert, moving with the kind of purposeful confidence that suggested he'd been expecting the call. His eyes found Laura immediately, a look that held something almost like satisfaction. He was holding a manila folder, thick with documentation. "Step away from the patient, Nurse Bennett. You're not authorized." The words were quiet. Calm. Almost conversational. Which meant they were weaponized. Laura stepped back. Her jaw was steady. Her breathing controlled. Everything about her body language said compliance, even as every clinical instinct was cataloging Morrison's declining vitals. His oxygen saturation was 89% now. His lips held the faint bluish tint that came when the body couldn't extract enough oxygen from the air it was pulling in. His daughter was crying, her hands moving in signs Morrison couldn't properly interpret. "Help him, please help him." Mercer paged the code team. "We'll have physician coverage in 3 minutes, nurse." That's the appropriate timeline. The code team was 3 minutes away, and Morrison's oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone, the indicator that pressurized air in his thoracic cavity was collapsing his lung in real time, suffocating him from the inside out. A charge nurse repeated Mercer's directive. Dr. Mercer was specific. "Wait for the physician." The words sounded rehearsed, as if Mercer had already given standing orders to everyone on the unit. Wait. Don't act. Let protocol protect him. Morrison's saturation dropped to 84%. This was the moment Mercer had been constructing. A moment where Laura would have to choose between the mission and the patient. Between staying hidden and staying operational. Between the 74 days of careful intelligence gathering and a Marine who trusted her competence enough to put her name on his skin. Laura looked at Morrison's tattoo. L. Bennett RN in military script, the letters carved into his left forearm where he'd see them every day. A reminder that someone had shown up when it mattered. A reminder that the system still contained people worth trusting. Then she looked at Mercer, at his calculated expression, at the folder he was holding like a shield. A folder that probably contained forged incident reports and fabricated complaints, all designed to ensure that if she acted, his paper trail would make her look reckless. She took one measured breath. He has tension pneumothorax. He needs decompression now. Not in 3 minutes. Mercer's voice snapped sharp. That's a physician's determination. You're a nurse. Know your scope. What he didn't know was that Laura's scope had included command authority over combat medical teams in hostile territory. That her training encompassed decision-making protocols far beyond civilian nursing standards. That every calculation he'd made was based on the assumption that she was what she appeared to be. Morrison's saturation dropped to 79%. She pushed past Mercer to the crash cart. The alarm shrieked at 2:06 a.m. Laura's hands moved before her brain registered the sound. 3 nights. That's how long Morrison had lasted at the rehabilitation facility before his chest cavity filled with air instead of breath, before his compromised lung collapsed inward like a fist closing, before someone finally called Cedar Creek Medical to bring him back to the one unit where he might actually live. She was already running. The crash cart squealed behind her, wheels catching on the tile floor as she moved through the cardiac unit's hallway. Morrison's daughter was screaming, not with her voice, because Morrison had taught her to sign since childhood, but with her hands, frantic shapes in the dim light that meant terror, meant help, meant please. Morrison's chest was a geography of silence. Left side, normal. Right side, nothing. No breath sounds. No expansion. His lips had taken on the blue-gray color of old bruises, and his oxygen saturation was falling like a stone through water. 79%. 74%. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a panicked rhythm that matched his daughter's signing. 3 other nurses stood in the doorway of his room, frozen in the peculiar paralysis that comes when protocol collides with crisis. They'd heard about Laura's suspension pending investigation. They'd seen Mercer's write-up. They knew which side was safer. Do nothing. Let someone else. Let liability sort itself out. Laura didn't look at them. She didn't weigh consequences or consider career trajectories. She reached into the crash cart and pulled the 14-gauge needle, wrapped in sterile plastic, the kind designed for exactly this moment, this airway, this choice between protocol and survival. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. "Talk to me," she said to Morrison's daughter. "Can he hear me?" The girl signing spiraled. "Yes, yes, can't breathe, something's wrong, please help him," but Morrison's eyes were open, tracking. Aware. Panicked. A Marine who'd survived roadside bombs and sniper fire now drowning on dry land while everyone around him calculated risk. Laura positioned him on his left side, felt for the landmarks her fingers had learned in Tikrit's field hospitals, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same in Atlanta as it had been in Iraq. Bodies didn't care about paperwork. They cared about pressure. They cared about air. The needle penetrated the chest wall with a sensation like breaking through thin ice. Laura pushed through the intercostal muscles, through the parietal pleura, until the hiss. The sound of air escaping under pressure, of a pneumothorax screaming itself free. It was the sound of salvation. Morrison's chest expanded. His shoulders lifted. His color improved within heartbeats, a transformation from gray-blue to something approximating alive. O2 sat climbed, 82%. 86%. 91%. Normal sinus rhythm. The kind of trajectory that meant yes, meant breathing, meant another day. The code team arrived 47 seconds later. They found Morrison stable. They found the tension pneumothorax resolved. They found Laura calmly disposing of the needle in the biohazard container, her posture unchanged, her face the color of concrete. And they found Dr. Mercer standing in the doorway with a manila folder that was so thick it looked like it contained Morrison's entire medical history rewritten by hand. "Nurse Bennett has just performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight," Mercer said. His voice was the texture of silk stretched over steel, controlled, almost triumphant. "In direct violation of my standing orders and hospital policy. This represents gross insubordination and creates massive liability exposure for Cedar Creek Medical." He opened the folder. Inside, incident reports bearing Laura's name for procedures she'd never performed. Patient complaint signed by people who'd never met her. Policy violation form citing regulations from units that didn't exist. A documentation trail like archaeological layers, each forged layer meticulously placed beneath the others, a foundation built for exactly this moment. A foundation designed to make her words meaningless. Effective immediately, Mercer continued, "Surrender your badge." Laura's jaw tightened once. A small muscle at her temple pulsed twice. Then, nothing. No protest. No explanation. No argument about the patient who was now breathing, about the daughter who'd stopped screaming, about the man whose heart was beating because she'd moved in the dark when others froze. Security arrived 5 minutes later. Two officers in polo shirts with the Cedar Creek Medical logo, their posture apologetic but firm. They escorted her out of the cardiac unit while Morrison, barely conscious through post-crisis sedation, watched her leave. His daughter's hands flew, asking the nurses what was happening, why the woman who saved her father's life was being removed from the room like contraband, like a criminal, like someone who'd violated trust instead of preserving it. Other nurses averted their eyes. Laura walked to the hospital laundry without being told where to go. Her feet knew the path. Down the service stairs, past the supply closets, through the basement corridor where the smell of antiseptic mixed with industrial bleach created a scent like surrender. Under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the same pitch as field hospital generators in Tikrit, she removed her scrubs. The blue fabric came off her shoulders, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight of 3 months lifted. 3 months undercover. 3 months documenting Mercer's billing patterns, his selective surgeries on vulnerable patients, his exploitation of men who'd already sacrificed enough. 3 months of being invisible. She folded the fabric slowly, precisely. The way she'd been trained to fold flags. The way she'd folded them at Arlington. Opposite corners meeting. Edges aligning. A ritual that transformed cloth into something sacred. The laundry attendant, an older man with trembling hands who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 23 years, took the bundle without comment. He'd seen nurses quit before. He didn't ask why. Laura stood in civilian clothes for the first time in months. Jeans. A borrowed sweater. A woman instead of a nurse. Her undercover identity dissolving like mist. She opened her locker. The folded flag was inside, not her own flag, but one she'd carried for 3 years, a flag taken from a fallen Marine at Fallujah, a flag she'd been tasked with returning to his family after the investigation concluded. The flag that represented the entire reason she'd come to Cedar Creek Medical. She held it against her chest and left the hospital at 3:52 a.m. The rain was falling soft and cold, the kind that moves through the darkness without making a sound. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical's lights continued burning. Mercer was probably still there, walking back to his office, already composing messages to his allies, already calculating next moves. Mission failure complete. For days later, Morrison had recovered enough to receive visitors. Laura sat quietly in the corner of his room, no longer staff, no longer authorized to be there. Just a visitor the charge nurse reluctantly permitted, a woman in street clothes who made the decision-makers nervous for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Morrison's daughter was beside him, teaching him to navigate the interpreter iPad that the hospital had finally provided, finally acknowledged should have been there from the beginning. The room smelled like flowers and healing and the particular grief that follows near death. When the elderly man appeared in the doorway, the entire room's atmosphere changed. He carried the scent of old tobacco and humidity, a man who'd lived in climates where air itself felt like weight. His eyes were the color of burnt copper, and when he saw Laura, his entire body went very still. "You are," he whispered. His English was careful, each word placed like a man crossing a stream on rocks. "You are Angel of Tikrit." Laura's spine straightened. Not stiffened. Straightened. Like a reflex recognizing a code. "I am translator," the man continued. "Enemy translator. You spare my life. You give me water. You call medevac for me when you could leave me. You say, he is human. He is wounded. We bring him." Morrison's daughter's hands began to move, interpreting, and Morrison's eyes widened. He'd heard parts of Laura's history. She'd never told him directly, protocol didn't permit it, but conversations happened in hospital rooms. Context accumulated. Morrison pulled up his sleeve. The tattoo was raised tissue now, white scar-colored, letters inked by someone with a steady hand and time to spare, L. Bennett RN. Below it, 2 other names. Marines. His brothers. Then he reached for his bedside table. His hands moved carefully, as though the object he was retrieving might shatter if handled improperly. The flag appeared, weathered cotton, faded colors, the kind of flag that had been kept in darkness for precisely 15 years. The flag from their fallen teammate. The flag no one else had been able to recover from Fallujah. "You are Captain," Morrison signed, his movements precise despite the recent trauma, the muscle memory of military bearing overriding physical pain. "You saved 3 of us. You were our officer." Dr. Mercer burst through the door. "I'm sorry," he said, already speaking over Morrison's translator, speaking over his daughter, speaking over the moment with the force of someone who'd spent his entire life refusing to let silence establish territory, but former staff members need to leave immediately. Hospital policy clearly states. The Iraqi translator was already dialing. His phone moved to his ear with the deliberateness of someone who'd spent years learning which calls mattered. He spoke rapid Farsi into the line, then switched to English. "I call my case officer. The woman who saved my life. Who get me asylum? Who is Marine captain in disguise? Yes. Tikrit. The angel." 20 minutes later, a Marine colonel in dress blues walked through the door. His uniform was pressed into geometry. His boots reflected the ceiling lights. He carried himself like a weapon at rest, purposeful, controlled, dangerous only if mishandled. In his hands, a folded citation and a photograph that showed 3 Marines and 1 translator standing in front of a damaged Humvee, all of them alive, all of them smiling. "Captain Laura Bennett," the colonel said, reading from the citation. His voice filled the room the way stone fills a canyon. "United States Marine Corps. Intelligence Operations Division." He paused. Mercer had backed toward the wall, his manila folder suddenly meaningless, his documentation trail suddenly irrelevant. "Silver Star for Valor under fire. Tikrit, Iraq." Morrison's hands came up to his face. Tears were moving down his cheeks now, not medication-induced, not shock-induced, but tears from the specific part of a Marine that remembers being saved by someone willing to die in the act. Saved 3 wounded Marines and 1 civilian under sustained enemy fire, the colonel continued. Carried all for 200 meters to extraction point. Sustained multiple gunshot wounds in the process. Returned to active duty within 6 weeks. Refused all subsequent stateside assignments. Nurses had gathered in the doorway now. The charge nurse. The cardiac resident. The unit secretary. All of them staring at the woman who'd been folding scrubs in their laundry 4 days ago. Currently serving in classified intelligence operations, the colonel said. Embedded in federal investigation of Medicare fraud targeting vulnerable veteran populations. Mercer's face had gone the color of old bone. The translator spoke again, his accent thickening with emotion, "The angel of Tikrit. We thought she was legend. They told us in Basra, in Baghdad, in the Green Zone. They said a captain with no name saved Marines the way angels save people. We did not know it was true." Morrison's daughter read the citation aloud for her father. Her voice was shaking as she signed simultaneously, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy. The last words were barely audible in the room's accumulated silence. Laura stood perfectly still. 1 tear traced down her face. She didn't wipe it until she'd held Mercer's eyes for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she'd known about the forged documents, long enough for him to realize that every file he'd built, every signature he'd fabricated, every patient he'd exploited had been documented by someone trained to notice patterns the way surgeons notice infection. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without anything that might suggest regret. The colonel added quietly, "And Dr. Mercer. The Pentagon's Fraud Investigation Unit would like a word about your billing practices. Starting with the $700,000 in Medicare charges for procedures never performed on patients who were never informed." Thursday morning arrived with Morrison lucid enough to recognize his sister's face, and by noon the cardiac unit felt different, visitors now, genuine relief, the statistical proof that he was going to survive what Dr. Mercer had tried to prevent. The translator came at 1:48 p.m., a man named Hassan who'd been granted asylum in 2009 after serving as an interpreter for the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Tikrit, a frail man now, weathered down to bone and kindness by 15 years of rideshare driving through Atlanta traffic, picking up passengers who had no idea they shared a vehicle with someone who remembered everything. He froze in the doorway of room for 12. His hands went still. And then he saw Laura Bennett sitting quietly in the corner, reading a chart that wasn't hers anymore, wearing the face of someone who'd saved his life in ways he was only now understanding. The whisper came out like prayer, "You are Angel of Tikrit." The room went so quiet you could hear the cardiac monitors in the adjacent beds, 3 different rhythms announcing the statistical fact of survival happening all around them. Morrison's sister, fluent in sign language and stationed at his bedside to interpret the medical conversations no iPad could adequately handle, froze mid-gesture. Laura didn't move. She simply existed in that corner the way she'd existed everywhere else, present, quiet, carrying the weight of secrets that were about to become visibility. Morrison's eyes cleared. Recognition crashed through the medication haze like a shock wave. He began signing frantically, his hands trembling not from fear but from the specific kind of shaking that happens when the person you owe your life to materializes from the blur of recovery drugs and surgical pain. His sister's voice moved from ASL to spoken English. He's saying you're the one. From Fallujah. From the evacuation. Morrison pulled his hospital gown aside. There it was, faded from 15 years of sun exposure and regret, a tattoo covering his left shoulder blade, dark blue script reading L. Bennett RN with a date 2009 beneath it, a permanent marking from a man who'd promised himself he'd never forget the captain who'd dragged him through burning streets toward a waiting Blackhawk while rounds came in like hail. The sister continued, "He says he's carried your name on his skin because," her voice cracked, "because he never thought he'd see you again to say thank you." Morrison moved with the careful deliberation of someone relearning his own body, reaching toward his bedside table with the precision of ritual. His trembling hands retrieved something wrapped in plastic, something that had survived every apartment move, every change of address, every moment when forgetting might have been easier. He unwrapped the plastic slowly, reverently, and unfolded an American flag, not pristine, worn at the edges, creased from 15 years of storage, a flag that had been draped over the casket of Corporal James Chen, killed in the same streets where Laura had carried Morrison toward that helicopter. The flag Morrison had kept because the captain who saved his life had been James's squad leader, and Morrison had made a promise to himself that if he ever survived, if he ever made it home, he would find her and return this to someone who could place it somewhere that mattered. The words came out of Morrison's mouth in sign language, interpreted by his sister's voice, "I kept it. All these years. For you." Boots on tile. Heavy. Authoritative. Dr. Mercer burst through the room's doorway already speaking, his words arriving before his body could fully cross the threshold. "Former staff need to leave immediately. This is a patient recovery space, not a reunion." His voice carried the specific tone of someone used to commanding rooms through volume and credential, the voice of a man who'd spent months building a paper case against a woman he'd underestimated and was about to discover he'd catastrophically misunderstood. Hassan raised his hand, a simple gesture, the kind of gesture that doesn't demand anything but somehow commands everything. His phone had been in his pocket the entire time. The call had been placed 45 minutes earlier, made while Morrison's sister was in the bathroom and Hassan sat alone with recognition crashing through him like artillery. The visitor's pass in Hassan's pocket came from a name, not his name, a different name on a different kind of credential, the kind that got you past security without questions because it came with the weight of official channels. The elevator doors opened at 2:19 p.m. and a Marine colonel walked out in dress blues, the uniform pressed so sharp it looked like origami made from regulation, his face the kind of face that had seen things and carried them with the specific grace of someone who'd chosen to remember everything. He was holding a citation folder, leather-bound, the kind of folder that contains official recognitions from people who don't give out recognitions casually. His voice arrived before anything else, "Captain Laura Bennett." Not a question. A statement with her rank embedded in it like a question mark nobody needed to ask. Mercer's face transformed. The competence drained out of it like someone had opened a valve. "I don't understand." "She's a nurse on administrative suspension," the colonel's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel, Bronze Star for Valor in Fallujah, 2008. He opened the folder. Military photographs, official seals, redacted portions that indicated classification levels she'd been operating under for the entire time she'd worked his cardiac unit. Silver Star, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2009. His eyes moved from the papers to Mercer's face. And this one doesn't get read aloud in hospital rooms. The folder stayed open, but his gaze shifted to Morrison, and the recognition between them was instant. A Marine to Marine, survivor to survivor, the specific understanding that happens when you've shared the weight of keeping people alive when the world was trying to kill them. Mercer began speaking, his lawyer's voice activating. I want to be very clear that I operated within all hospital protocols regarding. The colonel closed the folder. FBI's waiting in the boardroom. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The elevator descended at 2:31 p.m. and climbed again 23 minutes later with 5 federal agents and 2 Pentagon fraud investigators, the kind of people who carry warrants the way other people carry coffee. They had Mercer's computer by 3:04 p.m. They had his filing cabinet by 3:13 p.m. They had the spreadsheet by 4:11 p.m., the one where he'd tracked which patients were least likely to report irregularities, the column headers reading like a confession: deaf, non-English, elderly dementia, no family support, immigrant status. $700,000 in Medicare charges became $900,000 as they tallied the complete records. Timestamps on consent forms didn't match Mercer's computer's metadata. Patient signatures didn't match baseline handwriting samples pulled from prior hospital records. 19 other cases where he discouraged nursing staff from questioning his treatment protocols. One case where he'd explicitly ordered a nurse not to call a code when a patient's O2 saturations dropped into the 60s because the procedure he wanted to bill for required the patient to be compliant and sedated. Mercer's computer revealed he'd altered Laura's personnel file, adding disciplinary notes dated 3 months before she was hired, creating a retroactive case history that proved systematic insubordination in a timeline that was literally impossible. The incident report he'd filed about her performing unauthorized procedures was examined by the agents with the kind of precision that made his lawyer's face whiten. Emergency needle decompression for tension pneumothorax falls clearly within scope of practice for any RN with critical care certification. It falls specifically within emergency protocols. Mercer's documented order forbidding her from performing life-saving intervention in an emergency situation wasn't insubordination, it was potential negligent homicide, and the fact that Laura had disobeyed that order was the thing that proved her judgment was right and his was lethal. The hospital administrator arrived at 5:50 p.m. looking like someone who'd just realized he'd signed paperwork terminating a decorated intelligence officer based on the recommendations of a man who'd been embezzling from Medicare. Cedar Creek Medical's board arrived by 6:02 p.m. looking the same way. Mercer attempted to invoke attorney-client privilege at 6:56 p.m. The evidence was overwhelming by 7:02 p.m. The paperwork was complete by 7:45 p.m. Security walked him out at 8:11 p.m., his hands cuffed behind his back, his mouth open like he was still trying to explain something that couldn't be explained away. The nurses on the cardiac unit were standing in clusters near the supply station, the same ones who'd abandoned her in the break room, who'd whispered when she passed, and they watched him move through their space like a man who'd stopped being real. He was visible in the local news footage from 8:23 p.m. onward, the perp walk from the hospital entrance to the FBI sedan, his face caught in the camera lights, eyes darting, the bureaucrat who'd wielded paperwork as a weapon now drowning in his own documentation. Mercer's legal team negotiated the plea deal within a week. 16 counts of Medicare fraud. Falsifying medical records. Witness intimidation. Obstruction of a federal investigation. The judge was a Navy veteran, the kind of judge who understood what it meant that he'd targeted disabled veterans specifically, that he'd built spreadsheets to identify people least able to advocate for themselves. Prison was negotiated away, full restitution to Medicare, permanent loss of medical license, 5 years probation, and community service. The community service was specifically assigned by a judge who clearly understood humiliation as a form of accountability, CPR certification classes at an Atlanta community college, teaching the same basic procedure every week to disinterested students, minimum wage for a man who'd once billed at $400 an hour. Mercer now demonstrates chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Resuscitation, his hands moving through the motions of saving a life while students Google his name during breaks and read articles about Medicare fraud, about the Marine he'd tried to destroy, about the intelligence operative he'd underestimated. The plaque appeared on the cardiac unit's wall by the following Thursday, in honor of Captain Laura Bennett, USMC, guardian of those who served. Hassan became a U.S. citizen that same month, his naturalization ceremony attended by Colonel Holloway and 3 junior Marines from the Embassy Guard detail. Morrison's flag, the one he'd carried for 15 years, now sits in a shadow box in Laura's office at Walter Reed Medical Center, where she runs veteran advocacy programs and investigates healthcare fraud across military systems. The folded fabric from Tikrit has finally found its place of honor. The nurses who exiled her from the break room attended the ceremony where both Morrison and Laura were recognized. Shame was visible on their faces like sweat. They listen now when new hires ask about the plaque, and they tell the story the same way every time: the decorated Marine captain who worked beside them in disguise, the woman they failed to defend, the quiet person in the corner who turned out to be the most dangerous thing in the room. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the ones nobody sees coming, the quiet people who change everything. Like this video if you believe accountability matters more than credentials. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength?